In the rugged foothills of Montana Territory, 1878, a band of horse thieves was about to make the deadliest mistake of their lives. When they set their sights on the prize stallion at the Lambert Widows Ranch, they thought they'd found an easy mark, just another lonely homestead run by a grieving woman. They couldn't have been more wrong. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Lambert wasn't just any widow trying to keep her late husband's ranch alive. For nearly 2 decades, she'd been known as the Phantom Rider in Wild Bill Hickok's traveling show, a woman who could shoot a moving target at full gallop and ride like she was born in the saddle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Deep in the sprawling wilderness of Paradise Valley, where the Gallatin River carved its path through towering peaks, Eleanor Lambert's tale was about to remind these outlaws why some legends are best left undisturbed. This wasn't just another story of theft and vengeance. This was about how the West's most notorious horse thieves were about to learn that they'd stolen from the most skilled rider this side of the Rockies, a woman who could outshoot any man at 1,000 paces and was about to prove it. As dawn broke over Paradise Valley, Eleanor Lambert stood on her wraparound porch, her trusted Remington rifle resting easily in weathered hands. At 45, she moved with the same fluid grace that had made her famous in another life, her honey-brown hair, now threaded with silver at the temples, swept back in a practical braid. Her green eyes, sharp as a hawk's, constantly scanned the horizon, not out of fear, but habit. 20 years of performing death-defying feats had taught her to always be aware of her surroundings. Midnight. Her coal-black Arabian stallion paced restlessly in his paddock, sensing something in the air. Eleanor watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. He was more than just a horse. He was Richard's final gift to her, chosen specifically for his intelligence and spirit. Her late husband had understood that even after she'd hung up her performing clothes and settled into ranch life, some part of her would always need that connection to her past. The morning routine was sacred to Eleanor. Every dawn found her checking her weapons, maintaining them with the same precision she'd once used to plan her shows. The Remington had to be perfect, clean, oiled, reliable. It wasn't about protection, though the residents of nearby Bozeman whispered about the widow who spent each morning with her rifles. They didn't understand that for Eleanor, the routine was about honoring promises, to Richard, to herself, to the legacy they'd built together. "Easy there, boy," she called to Midnight, noting his continued agitation. The stallion's bloodline was impeccable, a blend of Arabian grace and American Mustang endurance. Richard had spent months tracking down the right breeding, knowing that Eleanor would appreciate the horse's combination of speed and intelligence. Now, watching Midnight's nervous pacing, Eleanor felt her own instinct sharpen. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Marcus Chen, who ran the neighboring ranch, appeared at her fence line. The son of Chinese railroad workers, Marcus had built his own success through sheer determination, earning respect in a territory that wasn't always welcoming to outsiders. His expression today was troubled, his usually cheerful demeanor darkened by concern. "Miss Eleanor," he called out, reining in his horse. "Heard about the Watson place?" Eleanor paused in her weapon maintenance. "What about it?" "Horse thieves. Hit it last night. Took their best horses, including that new stallion they brought up from Texas." Marcus leaned forward in his saddle, lowering his voice. "4th ranch this month. The sheriff thinks it's the Blackwood gang moving into the territory." Eleanor's hand stilled on her rifle. The Blackwood gang, she knew the name. Professional horse thieves who'd been working their way up from Colorado, leaving a trail of empty stables and grieving families in their wake. "Tell me more," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "They're organized, Eleanor, professional, not like the usual rustlers we get through here. They study their targets, know exactly what they're after. Marcus glanced at Midnight, who had moved closer to the fence, curious about the visitor. They've killed 5 men over Idaho territory. Nobody's even gotten a good look at them. They're like ghosts. Eleanor nodded slowly, processing the information. The Blackwood Gang's reputation had grown over the past year. They weren't just thieves, they were calculators, planners. They chose their targets carefully and struck with precision that spoke of military training. "You're out here alone," Marcus began, then caught himself at Eleanor's sharp look. "I know you can handle yourself, but maybe consider moving some of your stock closer to town, especially Midnight. Word of his bloodline has spread." Eleanor ran her hand along her rifle's barrel, a gesture that had once been part of her show routine, but now carried different weight. "The day I let fear change how I run this ranch is the day I should sell it and move back east." Marcus sighed, knowing better than to argue. He'd seen Eleanor handle trouble before, seen her drop 2 wolves at 400 yards to protect her cattle. But this was different. Just be careful. These men, they're not regular rustlers. They've got a system, and they're not afraid to kill to protect it. After Marcus rode off, Eleanor returned to her house, her movements deliberately measured despite the unease his words had stirred. In her bedroom, she opened a cedar chest that hadn't been touched in months. Inside lay her old performance outfit, black riding leathers tooled with silver, designed for both show and function. Beneath it rested a matched pair of Colt Peacemakers, their ivory handles worn smooth by years of practice. Eleanor closed the chest without removing anything. She'd chosen this quiet life when she married Richard, trading the roar of the crowd for the peace of the valley. The woman known as the Phantom Rider had disappeared the day she said her vows. But as she moved through her morning chores, she found herself paying extra attention to the terrain around her ranch, to the places where the broken country provided cover for men with bad intentions. The Blackwood Gang might be professionals, but they were about to learn that in Montana territory, things weren't always what they seemed. A simple widow's ranch might just turn out to be the deadliest ground they'd ever tried to steal from. Because while the Phantom Rider might have retired, she'd never stopped practicing. Every morning for the past 5 years, she'd maintained her skills, not for show, but for moments exactly like this. Eleanor's shots echoed off the valley walls as she put 3 rounds through a tin can at 300 yards. She hadn't planned to practice today, but Marcus's warning had stirred something in her blood. The familiar weight of the rifle, the smell of gunpowder, the satisfaction of perfect shots. It all brought memories flooding back. "You're still the best I've ever seen," Richard had told her the first time they met, after a show in St. Louis. He wasn't like the other men who came backstage with challenges and boasts. Richard Lambert had watched her performance with a craftsman's appreciation, understanding that her riding and shooting weren't just showmanship, they were art. The target practice was interrupted by hoofbeats approaching from the mountain trail. Eleanor lowered her rifle, recognizing the sound of multiple horses. Through the morning mist, she made out 3 riders, Dr. James Cooper, his daughter Catherine, and young Tommy Hayes from the general store. "Mrs. Lambert," Catherine called out, her medical bag bouncing against her saddle. Unlike many in the territory, Catherine had followed her father's footsteps into medicine, earning her degree back east before returning to help the growing community. "We were hoping to find you here." Eleanor set her rifle aside, noting the tension in their faces. "What brings you all this way?" "The Watson raid," Tommy spoke up, his 16-year-old voice cracking with excitement and fear. "Pa sent me to tell you. One of the Watson hands got a look at their leader. Says he's got a distinctive way of riding, sits his horse like a cavalry officer. Military trained," Eleanor mused, pieces clicking into place. "That fits with what Marcus said about their precision." Dr. Cooper dismounted, his weathered face grave. "There's more, Eleanor. The hand who saw them, He recognized the leader. "Says it's Colonel James Blackwood." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Memories rushed back. A military exhibition in St. Louis 10 years ago. A decorated Union cavalry officer who challenged her to a riding contest, claiming no woman could match his skill. She'd outridden him so thoroughly he'd been laughed out of the arena. His career had collapsed shortly after, rumors of battlefield. Atrocities finally catching up to him. "You know him?" Catherine asked, noticing Eleanor's reaction. "We met once," Eleanor said carefully. "He wasn't the kind of man who takes humiliation well." "That's putting it mildly," Dr. Cooper added. "After the war, he led a cavalry unit hunting Indians in Dakota Territory, got his whole command massacred, threw reckless orders, then blamed his scouts. Military discharged him, but not before he'd developed a taste for violence." Tommy leaned forward in his saddle. "They say he's got 20 men now, all ex-cavalry, been working their way up from Colorado, taking the finest horses they can find, using military tactics, sending scouts ahead to study their targets." Eleanor's mind raced. If Blackwood was behind the thefts, this wasn't just about stealing horses. The man she'd encountered in St. Louis had been proud, rigid, with a cold fury in his eyes that spoke of deeper instabilities. A man like that, nursing a grudge for 10 years, he wouldn't just steal her horse. He'd want to destroy everything she'd built. "There's something else," Catherine said softly. "The Watson hand who recognized Blackwood. He was found this morning. Someone put a bullet in his back during the night. Clean shot," Dr. Cooper added. "Professional, no witnesses, no tracks." Eleanor absorbed this information, her hand unconsciously moving to her rifle. Blackwood was eliminating witnesses, ensuring no one could warn his future targets, but he'd made a mistake. He didn't know she already knew him, already understood what kind of man she was dealing with. "Tommy," she turned to the boy. "Ride. Back to town. Tell your father I'll be in later to pick up my supplies. Dr. Cooper, Catherine, I appreciate the warning." After they rode off, Eleanor returned to her rifle practice with renewed focus. Each shot was deliberate, precise. She wasn't just maintaining skills now, she was preparing. Blackwood might have 20 men, military training and a decade of bitter hatred driving him, but he'd forgotten something crucial about their encounter in St. Louis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She hadn't just outridden him that day. She'd outshot him too, putting 12 bullets through 12 targets while riding at full gallop, a feat he'd failed to match even from a standstill. His humiliation had been complete, not just beaten, but beaten by a woman in front of a crowd. Of his peers, now he was in her territory, threatening her neighbors, killing innocent men. If he was working his way through the valley's finest horses, midnight would be on his list. The thought of Blackwood's hands anywhere near Richard's final gift sent a cold fury through her veins. Eleanor reloaded her rifle, sighting on a more distant target. The Phantom Rider had been more than just a stage name. It had been a promise of excellence, of precision, of justice when needed. She'd hung up the name when she married Richard, choosing a quieter life. But perhaps it was time for the Phantom Rider to make one final appearance, because if Blackwood thought he was hunting an aging widow living alone with a prize horse, he was about to learn a harsh lesson. He wasn't the hunter here. In these mountains, on this land she knew like her own heartbeat, he was about to become the prey. The bustling streets of Bozeman held more secrets than most frontier towns, but none quite like the truth behind Eleanor Lambert's past. As she rode midnight into town that afternoon, the usual whispers followed her progress. Most knew her only as Richard Lambert's widow, the quiet rancher who kept to herself. But old Sam Tucker, watching from his barbershop porch, knew better. Sam had been there in St. Louis 15 years ago when the Phantom Rider first made her name. He'd been a stagehand for Wild Bill's show, and he'd never forgotten the sight of Eleanor Kessler, as she was known then, emerging from a cloud of dust at full gallop, firing with impossible accuracy while controlling her horse with just her knees. Now, watching her dismount with that same fluid grace, Sam remembered other things too. The night 3 drunken cowboys had tried to prove the show was rigged, challenging her to shoot coins they'd throw. Eleanor had put a bullet through the center of each coin before it hit the ground, then handed the lead-embedded coins back to them as souvenirs. "Mrs. Lambert," Sam called out as she passed, "might have something you'd want to see." Eleanor followed him into his barber shop, where he pulled out an old theatrical poster from a dusty trunk. The paper was yellowed, but the image was still clear. A woman in black riding leathers, standing beside a white horse, twin colts drawn. "The Phantom Rider," the poster proclaimed, "the most daring horsewoman in the West." "Found it while cleaning," Sam said quietly. "Thought you might want it, what with Blackwood in the territory." Eleanor studied the poster, memories flooding back. "You know about Blackwood?" "Remember him too. That exhibition in St. Louis. He wasn't just any cavalry officer. He was known for breaking horses through cruelty, believing fear was the only way to master them." Sam's voice dropped lower. "After you beat him, he tried to claim you'd cheated, said no woman could ride like that without some trick. Wild Bill himself had to step in when Blackwood tried to sabotage your next show." "I remember," Eleanor said, softly. "He cut my saddle straps halfway through. If I hadn't checked them before the performance—" "That's not all." Sam pulled out a newspaper clipping. "Year after that exhibition, Blackwood led a cavalry charge against a Sioux village. Wasn't even supposed to engage. Had orders to negotiate. Instead, he killed everyone, even the women and children. Military covered it up. But that's the real reason he was discharged." Eleanor's fingers traced the old poster. "Why are you showing me this, Sam?" "Because folks need to know what's really coming. Blackwood's not just after horses. Man like that, carrying a grudge this long, he's after blood." Sam met her eyes. The Watson hand wasn't his first kill. 3 ranchers in Colorado tried to stop his gang, all found shot with military precision. Their horses weren't just stolen, they were butchered, like he was sending a message. The bell above the shop door chimed as Catherine Cooper entered. The young doctor stopped short at the sight of the poster. "That's you," she breathed, studying the image. "The Phantom Rider. I had a copy of that poster in my room back east. Every girl who wanted more than society allowed had one." Eleanor smiled slightly. "That was a lifetime ago." "No," Catherine said firmly. "That was you showing us what was possible. I kept that poster through medical school every time someone said women couldn't be doctors." She paused. "Does Blackwood know?" "Who are you really? If he does, he'll come prepared," Eleanor acknowledged. "If he doesn't, he'll underestimate you," Sam finished, "just like he did in St. Louis." The conversation was interrupted by commotion in the street. Marcus Chen rode up, his horse lathered with sweat. "Eleanor, Blackwood's men. They hit the Miller place last night, took every horse, burned the barn." Eleanor was already moving. "Casualties?" "Miller's boy took a bullet in the shoulder trying to stop them." "Catherine, they need you out there." Marcus paused, seeing the poster. "Well, that explains a few things." "Such as?" Eleanor asked. "Such as how you can outride every hand in the valley, such as why Richard used to grin like a proud fool whenever someone mentioned the Phantom Rider." Marcus's expression turned serious. "But it also means Blackwood's working his way to you. Miller's place is only 10 miles from your ranch." Eleanor turned to Sam. "That poster, how many others might have copies?" "Show printed hundreds," Sam admitted. "Most are probably dust now, but some might have reached Blackwood," Eleanor finished. "If he's been planning this, he might know exactly whose horse he's really after." Catherine grabbed her medical bag. "I'll ride to Miller's, but Eleanor, be careful. If Blackwood knows who you are, he won't just send men. He'll want to handle this himself. Good, Eleanor's voice was steel, because I've got some unfinished business with the Colonel. As Catherine and Marcus rode out, Eleanor studied the poster one last time. The woman in the image stared back with fierce confidence, a reminder of who she'd been before choosing a quieter life. But that life wasn't truly gone. It had just been waiting, like a gun in a drawer, for the moment it would be needed again. "They say you were the best," Sam said quietly. "Not just at shooting, but at reading horses, reading men. Could tell when a horse was about to spook, when a man was about to draw, just by watching their eyes." "The eyes always tell the truth," Eleanor replied. "That's how I knew Blackwood was dangerous, even before the exhibition. There was something wrong in his gaze, something that enjoyed causing pain." She turned to leave, but Sam caught her arm. "There's more you should know. After the Sioux massacre, when the army was investigating, they found Blackwood's personal effects. He kept trophies, not just from his victims, but from everyone who'd ever bested him. Pictures, newspaper clippings, personal items. Man's not just cruel, he's obsessed. You think he's been planning this? All these years? Think he's been working up to it? The other horse thefts, the killings, their practice, learning the territory, testing defenses." Sam's voice was grim. "He's not just after Midnight Eleanor, he's after the woman who humiliated him, the Phantom Rider herself." Eleanor absorbed this information, her mind already shifting plans. If Blackwood knew who she was, he'd be expecting her skills, preparing for them. But he'd be expecting the show rider, the performer who needed an audience. He wouldn't be ready for what she'd become in the years since. A woman who'd learned to use those same skills for survival. "Sam," she said finally, "I need you to send some messages. Dr. Cooper first. Tell him to warn people about traveling alone. Then Marcus Chen. His ranch hands know these mountains better than anyone. And finally, find Tommy Hayes. I need him to ride to Fort Ellis. Tell them what's coming. The army won't intervene in civilian matters," Sam warned. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but they need to know their former colonel has resurfaced, and they need to be ready when this ends, one way or another." Outside, Midnight sensed his rider's tension, dancing slightly as she mounted. Eleanor calmed him with a practiced touch, remembering how she'd first learned to communicate with horses, not through force like Blackwood, but through understanding, through partnership. "One more thing," Sam called as she turned to leave. "The night Blackwood tried to sabotage your show. It wasn't Wild Bill who caught him, it was Richard. He saw Blackwood near the stables, followed him, stopped him before he could do worse than cut the straps." Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. "Richard never told me." "No, he wouldn't have. But he knew what Blackwood was, even then. Maybe that's why he made sure you kept practicing even after you left the show. Man like Richard Lambert, he'd have known someday the past might come calling." The next morning painted Paradise Valley in shades of gold and amber, transforming Eleanor's ranch into a sanctuary of routine and purpose. Before the revelations in town, before Sam's warnings stirred old memories, this had been her world, carefully built, meticulously maintained, filled with the quiet satisfaction of honest work. The ranch hands wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving Eleanor her cherished solitude as she walked the fence line. 5 years of tending this land had taught her every dip and rise, each hidden, spring and sheltered hollow. The cattle grazed peacefully in the lower meadow, their breaths creating tiny clouds in the crisp morning air. In the vegetable garden, Richard had helped her plant that first year autumn squash ripened on sturdy vines. Eleanor knelt to check their progress, remembering how he'd laughed at her initial reluctance to trade her performing leathers for gardening clothes. "Life's not all grand gestures," he'd said, showing her how to test the soil. "Sometimes the biggest victories are the smallest ones, grown day by day." The kitchen still held traces of his influence, dried herbs hanging from rafters he'd installed, the big cast-iron stove he'd insisted on buying when the old one died. Eleanor stoked its fire, starting her morning bread-making ritual. The familiar motions of kneading dough centered her, connecting past to present. A sharp whistle from the pasture caught her attention. Through the window, she watched young Jamie Chen, Marcus's oldest son, arriving early to help with the horses. At 17, he shared his father's gift with animals, handling them with natural patience and grace. "Morning, Mrs. Lambert," Jamie called out, leading his pinto mare to the spare stall. "Pa sent me to help with the new foal." Eleanor wiped flour from her hands. In the breeding paddock, one of her mares had given birth 3 days ago, the foal, still learning its legs. Perfect timing, she needs her morning check. Together they approached the mare and foal. Jamie moved with careful confidence, speaking softly in a mix of English and Chinese. The mare's ears flicked forward, recognizing a friend. "She's strong," Jamie observed, running practiced hands down the foal's legs. "Good bone structure. Your father taught you well. He says you taught him better." Jamie glanced up. "That first year, when other ranchers wouldn't sell to Chinese buyers, you not only sold him your best mare, but showed him your training methods." Eleanor checked the foal's gums, ensuring good color. "Your father earned my respect. He understands horses aren't just property, they're partners." The morning unfolded with comfortable familiarity. More ranch hands arrived, going about their tasks with well-practiced efficiency. Eleanor had chosen each one carefully over the years, valuing character over experience. They were family now, loyal to the bone. By midday, the bread had cooled enough for sharing. The hands gathered in the shade of the big oak tree, trading stories between bites. Eleanor sat slightly apart, watching them with quiet pride. This was what she and Richard had dreamed of, not just a successful ranch, but a community. Sarah Williams, who helped with the cattle, passed around fresh coffee. At 25, she'd fled an arranged marriage back east, finding refuge at the Lambert Ranch. Eleanor had recognized something of herself in the young woman's determination, teaching her ranching skills when other places would have turned her away. Mail came, Sarah announced, handing Eleanor several letters, including one from that horse buyer in California. Eleanor sorted through the correspondence, pausing at an elaborate envelope. Inside, an invitation to perform at the upcoming territorial fair promised substantial payment for an appearance by the legendary Phantom Rider. She set it aside, unopened, just as she had dozens like it over the years. The afternoon brought Catherine, Hooper back from tending the Miller boy. "He'll heal," she reported, accepting a cup of coffee. But Eleanor, Blackwood's men didn't just steal horses. They destroyed Miller's breeding records, his bloodline documentation. They're erasing histories. Eleanor nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much. Blackwood wasn't just stealing valuable horses. He was systematically dismantling the foundations of each ranch he targeted. How's Miller taking it? Hard. Those records represented 3 generations of careful breeding. Catherine hesitated. "There's something else. While I was there, I noticed boot prints by the records cabinet. Military issue, but an older style. The kind they stopped using after the war. Blackwood himself," Eleanor murmured. "He was there, watching." The doctor's daughter studied her mentor carefully. "You're different today. Calmer." "This is my ground," Eleanor explained. "Out here, everything makes sense. The rhythms of the land, the needs of the animals, the cycle of seasons. It's all connected, all purposeful." They watched Jamie working with a young stallion in the training ring, using the gentle methods Eleanor had taught. The horse moved, willingly, responding to subtle cues. "You could have kept performing," Catherine observed, "been famous, wealthy." "I chose this life," Eleanor corrected. "The difference matters. Every morning I wake up knowing exactly who I am, what needs. There's peace in that." As evening approached, the hands departed for their own homes or the bunkhouse. Eleanor walked her evening rounds, checking each animal, securing each gate. In the gathering dusk, Midnight nickered a greeting as she entered his paddock. The stallions, coat gleamed like liquid shadow in the fading light. Eleanor ran her hands over him, checking for any signs of distress. He was Richard's masterpiece, the culmination of everything he'd learned about breeding and training. More than that, he represented their shared vision of how horses should be handled, with respect rather than force. A distant wolf's howl echoed from the mountains, answered by another closer to the ranch. Eleanor noted their locations automatically, part of her constant awareness of her surroundings. The wolves rarely bothered the cattle, respecting the boundaries she'd established through selective culling rather than wholesale slaughter. In her bedroom, Eleanor opened the chest containing her performance gear. The black leather still gleamed, the silver conchos catching lamplight. She removed each piece carefully, the fitted jacket designed for maximum mobility, the split skirt that allowed a proper seat in the saddle, the special holsters that had made her famous for lightning fast. Drawers. But tonight, she wasn't seeking memories. Instead, she removed the false bottom Richard had installed, revealing documents he'd carefully preserved. Maps of the territory marked with hidden trails and sheltered valleys, detailed notes on water, sources and natural barriers, everything a person might need if they had to disappear into the wilderness or trap someone else there. "The land is your ally," Richard had told her, teaching her to read the mountain's moods. "Know it better than your opponent, and you'll never truly be outnumbered." Eleanor replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight was for appreciating what she'd built here, this peaceful world of meaningful work and earned trust. If Blackwood thought attacking it would break her spirit, he'd fatally misunderstood what made the Phantom Rider legendary. It wasn't the tricks or the shooting or even the riding. It was the discipline beneath the showmanship, the endless hours of practice, the absolute dedication to doing things right. The same qualities that had made her a performer now made her a rancher, a neighbor, a leader worth following. Let Blackwood come with his cruel methods and bitter grudges. She'd show him what happened when someone threatened not just her horse, but her home, her people, everything she'd spent 5 years building. Because while the Phantom Rider might have been a stage name, the skills behind it had been forged through decades of dedication, and unlike Blackwood, she hadn't spent the past decade nursing old wounds. She'd spent it growing stronger, deeper, more connected to the land and people around her. He was about to learn that the woman who'd humiliated him in St. Louis was only a shadow of who she'd become. The first hint of trouble came not from gunfire or hoofbeats, but from silence. As Eleanor inspected the upper pasture at dawn, she noticed the songbirds had stopped their morning chorus. The cattle, usually spread out grazing, huddled together near the center of the field, nature's warning signs, clear as signal fires to those who knew how to read them. Through her spyglass, she spotted unusual movement along the ridgeline, a flash of metal catching sunlight, quickly withdrawn. Someone was watching the ranch, studying patterns, learning routines, professional reconnaissance, military style. A commotion from the lower barn drew her attention. Jamie Chen burst out, running toward her position. "Mrs. Lambert, track marks. By the east fence, fresh ones. Multiple horses, moving quiet, keeping to soft ground." Eleanor followed him to the location. The signs were subtle. Broken grass stems, a displaced stone, the barest impression of horseshoes in shadowed earth. But the pattern was unmistakable. "Scout party," she concluded. "Probably 3 riders, testing our awareness." "Should we alert the hands?" "Not yet. Let's keep this quiet." Eleanor studied the track's direction. "They're probing, looking for blind spots. Best defense is letting them think they've found some." Returning to the main house, Eleanor found Catherine Cooper, waiting on the porch, her medical bag beside her. The young doctor's expression was grave. "2 strangers checked into the boarding house last night. Mrs. Henderson says they asked peculiar questions about local ranches, especially yours." Description. Former military by their bearing. One had a distinctive limp, cavalry wound. From the way he favors it, the other wore his gun, cavalry-style cross-draw. Catherine lowered her voice. They claimed to be horse buyers, but their questions focused on security arrangements, guard schedules. Eleanor processed this information, adding it to her mental map of gathering threats. They're establishing a perimeter, working inward. Classic military encirclement. There's more, Catherine continued. Father treated a man this morning. Stranger wouldn't give his name. Bullet graze on his arm, claiming it was a hunting accident, but father noticed powder burns on his sleeve. Someone shot at him close range within the past day. A rider approached from the town road, Sarah Williams, returning from her supply run. Her usual easy confidence was replaced by tense alertness. Strangers in town, she reported. 4 men at the saloon, 2 more at the livery. They're asking about the phantom rider, offering gold for information. And Tucker at the barber shop fed them a story about you retiring to California. Henderson at the boarding house swears you moved to Oregon. Seems everyone in town has a different tale about where the famous rider went. Sarah managed a grim smile. Nobody's mentioned the widow Lambert. Eleanor nodded, appreciating the town's loyalty. Any sign of Blackwood himself? No, but... Sarah hesitated. There's talk about a camp in the high country. Hunters reported seeing smoke from multiple fires, hearing horses. More men than any normal outfit would need. The pieces aligned into a clear pattern. Blackwood was establishing a staging area, positioning men around the valley, gathering intelligence. But he wasn't just preparing to steal a horse. He was setting up a military operation. Jamie, who'd been watching the ridgeline, suddenly stiffened. Movement in the scrub oak. Single rider, trying to stay hidden. Eleanor raised her spyglass. The figure was indeed attempting concealment, but something about their posture caught her attention. Not one of Blackwood's men, she decided. Too cautious, too aware of sightlines. As if confirming her assessment, the rider emerged from cover, revealing Marshal Daniel Hayes from the territorial office. He approached openly, hands clear of his weapons. "Miss Lambert," he called, dismounting. "Thought I should deliver this personally." He handed her a telegram. "Report from Fort Ellis. They've been tracking Blackwood's movement since Colorado. His gang's grown, nearly 30 men now, all ex-military. They hit the Wakefield Ranch 2 days ago." "Wakefield?" Catherine interrupted. "That's over 50 miles south. They're moving fast, striking targets seemingly at random." Hayes spread a map across the porch railing. "But there's a pattern. Each raid takes the best horses. Yes, but also destroys breeding records, equipment, anything that would help the ranches rebuild." Eleanor studied the map, noting the raid locations. He's not just stealing, he's systematically dismantling the region's horse trade. Why? "Control," Sarah suggested. "Destroy enough bloodlines, enough documentation, and suddenly anyone wanting quality horses has to go through him. There's worse," Hayes continued. 2 of the raised ranches had connections to Wild Bill's show. The Wakefield place was owned by a former trick rider. The Thompson spread belonged to Bill's old horse trainer. The implications were clear. Blackwood wasn't just attacking random targets. He was methodically eliminating anyone connected. To his past humiliation, a distant flash caught Eleanor's eye, sunlight reflecting off glass from the ridge. "Down!" she commanded. Everyone dropped as a shot kicked splinters from the porch post. "Sniper," Hayes muttered. "Professional work, using the sun's glare for cover." Eleanor had already calculated the distance, factoring in wind and elevation. "Jamie, my Sharps rifle, the long-range one." The young man returned with the weapon. Eleanor took careful aim, not at the sniper's position, but at a rock face 30 feet to their left. Her shot cracked off the stone, sending fragments spraying toward the hidden marksman. A figure scrambled, from cover beating a hasty retreat. "Warning shot?" Catherine asked. "Message," Eleanor corrected. Letting them know their range estimation was wrong. That sniper thought he was safely out of reach, Hayes whistled softly. That's got to be 900 yards. Not many can make that kind of shot, even indirectly. Blackwood knows now, Sarah observed, if he didn't already. Eleanor nodded. He's testing defenses, probing for weaknesses. That sniper was meant to rattle us, make us nervous. Instead, you rattled him, Jamie grinned. Maybe. Eleanor wasn't so sure. Something about the shooting felt wrong, too obvious, too easily countered. Or maybe it was meant to confirm something. Catherine caught her meaning. To confirm you're still as good as the stories say, which means Blackwood's real plan is still coming. Eleanor turned to Hayes. Marshal, I need you to get word to Fort Ellis. Tell them Blackwood's not just after horses. He's waging a personal war, and he's using military tactics to do it. They won't intervene without clear jurisdiction, Hayes warned. No, but they can alert other law enforcement, set up containment. Eleanor paused. And they can investigate why their former colonel's actions seemed to follow old military patrol routes, almost like he had access to official maps. Hayes' eyes widened at the implication. You think he has help inside the fort? I think a man this methodical, this well-informed, has to have sources. Find them. After Hayes departed, Eleanor gathered her small council. Sarah, alert the hands. Double watches. No one rides alone. Jamie, get word to your father. His people know these mountains better than anyone. We'll need those skills soon. Catherine, your father should prepare for casualties. This won't end clean. As they dispersed to their tasks, Eleanor returned to studying the terrain through her spyglass. Blackwood's strategy was becoming clear. Isolate, intimidate, then strike. But he'd made a crucial mistake. By revealing his presence too early, by letting her confirm her shooting skills were intact, he'd given her time to prepare. And Eleanor Lambert had learned far more in the past 5 years than just ranching. Twilight bled across Paradise Valley, painting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers toward Eleanor's ranch. The evening began with an unexpected visitor. Claire Thompson, youngest daughter of the neighboring Thompson Ranch, galloping through the main gate as if demons chased her heels. They took everything. Claire's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. Not just the horses. They burned. The stables destroyed Papa's workshop, said it was a message for anyone who helped the Phantom Rider. Eleanor steadied the girl's trembling hands. Start from the beginning. When? 2 hours ago. 20 men, maybe more. Claire's words tumbled out. Led by a man with a scarred face. Not Blackwood, someone else. They knew things, Mrs. Lambert. Knew about Papa making special saddles for Wild Bill's show years ago. Said anyone who'd aided the Phantom Rider had to pay. Catherine Cooper emerged from the house, medical bag in hand. You're bleeding, Claire. The girl glanced at her arm, seemingly surprised by the blood staining her sleeve. One of them tried to stop me from riding for help. I hit him with a shovel. Good girl, Eleanor approved, noting how Claire had instinctively taken the most difficult trail to follow in the dying light. Where's your family? Safe. Papa led them to the old mining cabin when we first spotted riders approaching. He made me wait until they were distracted with the horses, then sent me to warn you. Claire's eyes filled with tears. But Thunder, our best stallion, they didn't just take him, they shot him. Said quality horses were only for quality people. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Blackwood's lieutenant was sending a message all right, not just destruction of property, but deliberate cruelty, breaking spirits as well as livelihoods. Sarah Williams appeared with a steaming cup of tea. Marshal Hayes should be back from Fort Ellis by now. We could send word. No. Eleanor's voice was steel. That's what they expect, us calling for help, pulling law enforcement away from other targets. This isn't just about us anymore. Jamie Chen rode in from his evening patrol, expression grim. Smoke on the horizon. 3 directions: Thompson Place, Miller's Ranch, And looks like the Watson spread too. They're hitting multiple targets, dividing our response. Eleanor nodded. Military strategy. Force us to split our resources. Catherine finished bandaging Claire's arm. They're targeting anyone connected to your past. The Thompsons made saddles for the show, the Millers supplied horses, and the Watsons... Robert Watson was Wild Bill's business partner, Eleanor confirmed. He bankrolled several seasons, including the one where I first performed. She turned to Jamie. Get word to your father. Tell him to alert his network. Anyone with show connections needs to evacuate. Now. Already happening, Jamie replied. Pa's people have been watching the high trails. They saw Blackwood's men positioning themselves yesterday. Most families are already headed for safe houses in town. Eleanor studied the gathering darkness. The timing of these attacks wasn't random. New moon tonight, she mused. Perfect conditions for their main thrust. Claire's warning wasn't just about the Thompson raid. It was meant to pull our attention south while they set up their real approach from the north. Sarah caught her meaning. You think the ranch raids are a diversion? Blackwood's too methodical. For random destruction. He's herding us like cattle into a corral. Eleanor turned to Catherine. Your father still has those maps from his army days? The ones showing the old cavalry patrol routes? In his office. But get them. Bring them to Maria's cabin up on Eagle Ridge. And Catherine, don't take the main trail. As the doctor's daughter rode out, Eleanor gathered her remaining allies. Claire, you'll stay here with Sarah. Jamie, find Tommy Hayes. Tell him to spread. Word in town. Anyone who's ever had a connection to Wild Bill's show needs to disappear tonight. What about you? Sarah asked, noting Eleanor checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. I'm going to spring Blackwood's trap. At their startled looks, she continued, He's expecting us to fortify the ranch, concentrate our defense here. That's why he's hitting other targets, to make us hunker down, wait for him to come to us. But that's exactly what he wants, Claire protested. No, Eleanor's smile held no warmth. He wants us scared, defensive, reacting instead of acting. So we're going to give him something else entirely. She mounted Midnight, the stallion sensing her mood and dancing with controlled energy. Sarah, you're in charge here. Signal system we discussed. 3 shots means pull back to town, 2 means call in Hayes and his deputies. 1 shot means you've got Blackwood in your sights, Sarah finished. But Eleanor, going out alone, I won't be alone. Eleanor checked her rifles one final time. I'll have an army of shadows on my side. Marcus's people know every trail, every hiding spot. Maria's family has watched these mountains for generations. While Blackwood's men are busy watching the ranch, a dozen eyes will be watching them. Jamie stepped forward. Pa's riders are already in position. High passes, water holes, anywhere they might try to move stolen horses through. Eleanor nodded. Approval. Remember, Blackwood expects the Phantom Rider to be a performer, someone who needs an audience. He's forgotten that the best hunters work in silence. As she rode out, Eleanor touched the pouch at her belt. Not ammunition, but something more precious. Inside lay a piece of paper she'd found in Richard's documents, something he'd written the day before his death, a letter she'd only discovered this morning, hidden in a false bottom of his desk. My dearest Eleanor, it read. If you're reading, this then the past has finally caught up to us. I've known since St. Louis that Blackwood wouldn't let his humiliation rest. That's why I've spent years preparing, mapping trails, establishing networks, making sure you'd have everything you need when he finally surfaced. The Phantom Rider wasn't just a stage name, love. It was a prophecy. Show them why. Eleanor tucked the letter away, focusing on the task ahead. Blackwood had spent a decade plotting revenge, thinking he was hunting a retired performer. Instead, he'd started a war with someone who'd spent those same years learning every secret of these mountains, building alliances with people he'd never even notice. The first stars emerged as Eleanor guided midnight into the shadowed valleys. Behind her, the ranch lights beckoned like a trap ready to be sprung. Ahead, darkness promised concealment for those who knew how to use it. Blackwood wanted to face the Phantom Rider? Fine. But this performance wouldn't be under bright lights. For a cheering crowd, this would be a demonstration of why some legends are born in shadow, not spotlight, and why a woman who could outshoot any man in broad daylight might be even more dangerous in the dark. The mountain paths whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Eleanor caught movement in her peripheral vision. Maria's youngest, grandson Louis, materializing from the underbrush like a spirit. The 12-year-old boy had inherited his grandmother's gift for moving unseen through the wilderness, Senora, he whispered in Spanish. They have men at Crystal Creek Pass. 6 riders, heavily armed. They're setting up something. Metal objects. On tripods, heliograph stations, Eleanor realized. For signaling at night, they're creating a communication network. She studied the boy's dirt-smudged face. What else? No. Eleanor's smile held no warmth. He wants us scared, defensive, reacting instead of acting. So we're going to give him something else entirely. She mounted Midnight, the stallion sensing her mood and dancing with controlled energy. Sarah, you're in charge here. Signal system we discussed. 3 shots means pull back to town. 2 means call in Hayes and his deputies. 1 shot means you've got Blackwood in your sights, Sarah finished. But Eleanor, going out alone. I won't be alone. Eleanor checked her rifles one final time. I'll have an army of shadows on my side. Marcus's people know every trail, every hiding spot. Maria's family has watched these mountains for generations. While Blackwood's men are busy watching the ranch, a dozen eyes will be watching them. Jamie stepped forward. Pa's riders are already in position. High passes, water holes, anywhere they might try to move stolen horses through. Eleanor nodded. Approval. Remember, Blackwood expects the Phantom Rider to be a performer, someone who needs an audience. He's forgotten that the best hunters work in silence. As she rode out, Eleanor touched the pouch at her belt. Not ammunition, but something more precious. Inside lay a piece of paper she'd found in Richard's documents, something he'd written the day before his death. A letter she'd only discovered this morning, hidden in a false bottom of his desk. My dearest Eleanor, it read. If you're reading this, then the past has finally caught up to us. I've known since St. Louis that Blackwood wouldn't let his humiliation rest. That's why I've spent years preparing, mapping trails, establishing networks, making sure you'd have everything you need when he finally surfaced. The Phantom Rider wasn't just a stage name, love. It was a prophecy. Show them why. Eleanor tucked the letter away, focusing on the task ahead. Blackwood had spent a decade plotting revenge, thinking he was hunting a retired performer. Instead, he'd started a war with someone who'd spent those same years learning every secret of these mountains, building alliances with people he'd never even notice. The first stars emerged as Eleanor guided Midnight into the shadowed valleys. Behind her, the ranch lights beckoned like a trap ready to be sprung. Ahead, darkness promised concealment for those who knew how to use it. Blackwood wanted to face the Phantom Rider? Fine. But this performance wouldn't be under bright lights. For a cheering crowd, this would be a demonstration of why some legends are born in shadow, not spotlight, and why a woman who could outshoot any man in broad daylight might be even more dangerous in the dark. The mountain paths whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Eleanor caught movement in her peripheral vision. Maria's youngest, grandson, Luis, materializing from the underbrush like a spirit. The 12-year-old boy had inherited his grandmother's gift for moving unseen through the wilderness. Senora, he whispered in Spanish. They have men at Crystal Creek Pass. 6 riders, heavily armed. They're setting up something, metal objects, on tripods. Heliograph stations, Eleanor realized. For signaling at night, they're creating a communication network. She studied the boy's dirt-smudged face. "What else?" "Time to begin," she told Marcus. "Remember, when the signals start, hit every station. Let's show them why mountain warfare isn't like cavalry charges on open plains." As she guided Midnight into the deepening darkness, Eleanor felt the weight of Richard's letter against her heart. Her husband had known this day would come and had spent years preparing for it. Now she understood why he'd insisted she maintain her skills, why he'd helped her build such strong connections with the local families. Blackwood thought he was facing a lone performer past her prime. Instead, he was about to confront a woman who commanded an invisible army, who knew these mountains like she knew her own heartbeat. He'd spent a decade nurturing his revenge, but she'd spent that same time building something far more powerful. A community bound by loyalty and respect. Let him spring his trap. Let him think he had her cornered. Eleanor Lambert was about to teach Colonel James Blackwood the difference between theatrical performance and mountain justice. And this lesson would be written in gunpowder and starlight. Moonless night cloaked the mountains in velvet darkness as Eleanor positioned herself on the ridge overlooking Blackwood's heliograph stations. Below, his men moved with military precision, unaware that their supposedly secure perimeter had already been compromised. Through her spyglass, she counted 12 soldiers at the main signal post, their uniforms a mix of cavalry gear and civilian clothing. A flicker of light caught her attention. Someone approaching from the mine complex with a lantern. The way he carried himself, straight-backed and imperious, told Eleanor everything she needed to know. Colonel James Blackwood had finally emerged to oversee his operation personally. Even at this distance, she could see how the years had changed him. The proud cavalry officer from St. Louis had grown leaner, harder, his movements sharp, with barely contained rage. He barked orders at his men, gesturing toward the valley with quick, aggressive motions. "Quite a force he's assembled," Marshal Hayes whispered, materializing beside her position. The lawman had shed his usual formal attire for dark clothing that blended with the shadows. "My count shows 43 men, all ex-military. Some I recognize from wanted posters, deserters, mercenaries, men with scores to settle." Eleanor nodded, noting how Blackwood's soldiers maintained strict formation even in their casual movements. He's rebuilt his command, replacing the men he lost in that massacre. But these aren't just hired guns. They're true believers. Look how they defer to him. "Spotted something else," Hayes continued. "Supply wagons coming in through Crystal Pass. But they're not just carrying provisions. Saw metal cages, special hobbles, the kind used for transporting high-strung horses. He's planning to take more than just Midnight," Eleanor realized. "He wants every valuable horse in the valley, building his own breeding operation with stolen bloodlines." Movement in the underbrush announced Maria's arrival. The old woman's dark eyes reflected starlight as she surveyed the enemy position. "My grandchildren have counted their weapons," she reported in soft Spanish. "Many rifles, new models, and something else, boxes marked with military stamps, explosives perhaps." Eleanor's mind raced through implications. He's not just planning to steal horses. He's going to make sure no one can rebuild afterward. "Destroy the competition completely." Hayes shifted uneasily. "That's not all. Got word from Fort Ellis. They found evidence someone's been accessing old patrol maps, requisition forms, military communications, someone with current credentials." "The local traitor," Eleanor murmured. "Any leads?" "Nothing solid, but whoever it is has enough authority to redirect army patrols away from this area. We're on our own out here." A flash of light from the valley drew their attention. One of Blackwood's men was testing the heliograph, sending a practice signal. Eleanor smiled grimly as she recognized the pattern. "They're using old cavalry codes." "Predictable." Maria's expression turned crafty. "My people know these signals. In the wars, we learned to intercept messages, change their meaning with small adjustments. On mirror tilted wrong, the message says something very different. Perfect. Eleanor's mind was already forming plans. We'll let them establish their network, get comfortable with it. Then, when they depend on it most, we feed them false information, Hayes finished. But Eleanor, something's been bothering me. Why now? Blackwood's had years to plan this. Why choose this particular moment? Before she could answer, Luis appeared like a shadow made flesh. Senora, riders approaching from town. 2 men, moving fast. One looks like Deputy Phillips. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Phillips, the one man in the sheriff's office she'd never quite trusted. Maria, your best scouts. I need eyes on those riders. Don't engage, just listen. The old woman melted into the darkness, taking Luis with her. Eleanor turned to Hayes. Marshal, I need you back in town. Something's not right. Phillips shouldn't be out here. You think he's the leak? I think we're about to find out. As Hayes departed, Eleanor caught a glimpse of another signal, this one from Marcus Chen's position on the opposite ridge. 3 quick flashes. Urgent news. She worked her way carefully through the darkness, using every trick she'd learned in 20 years of performance riding to move silently over treacherous ground. Marcus waited in a natural hollow, his expression grim. Found something in the mine office you need to see. He handed her a leather folder. Bank drafts, property deeds, transfer papers, all ready to be filed. Eleanor examined the documents in the dim starlight. Her breath caught as she understood their meaning. These are ownership transfers for every major ranch in the valley. Not just transfers, Marcus pointed to specific lines. Forced sales, already dated and signed. They're planning to make it look legal. After they destroy our ability to operate, they'll offer to buy us out. Eleanor's voice hardened. Rock-bottom prices for failing operations. And with no breeding stock, no records, we'd have no choice but to sell. Marcus paused. There's more. Found telegraph transcripts. Someone's been coordinating with buyers in California, Mexico, even Europe, setting up sales for horses they haven't stolen yet. A twig snapped in the darkness. Both froze, weapons ready. Catherine Cooper emerged from the shadows, her doctor's bag clutched tight. Eleanor, thank God. Father sent me. You need to see this immediately. She pulled a journal. From her bag, elegant leather, expensive paper. Found this hidden in Sheriff Davis's office. Records going back months. Details about every ranch, every valuable horse. Notes about security, daily routines, especially yours. Eleanor's mind raced as she scanned the pages. The handwriting was familiar. She'd seen it on official documents, permits, licenses. Davis, he's Blackwood's inside man. More than that, Catherine's voice shook. There are medical records here too, including details about Richard's last illness. The implications hit like physical blows. Sheriff Davis had been a frequent visitor during Richard's final days, bringing news, offering support. He'd helped Eleanor handle the paperwork after Richard's death, guided her through legal requirements. He helped murder my husband. Eleanor's voice was ice. Worked with Blackwood to poison him, then helped me through my grief, all while feeding information to my enemies. Marcus touched her arm gently. Eleanor. No. She straightened, cold, fury replacing shock. This changes everything. Blackwood's not just here to steal horses or destroy ranches. This is about power, controlling the entire valley's horse trade. And Davis has been helping him set it up for years. Catherine nodded grimly. Father found evidence in Davis's records. They've been planning this since before Richard died. The sheriff's been buying up water rights, strategic properties. Once Blackwood's operation destroys the existing ranches, Davis swoops in as the savior, Eleanor finished, offering to buy out struggling ranchers, consolidating control. And Blackwood provides the horses, starting a new breeding program with stolen bloodlines. A bird call split the darkness, Maria's signal for urgent news. Moments later, the old woman appeared with Luis. The deputy, she reported. He meets with Blackwood's men, gives them papers, maps. They speak of moving tonight before the moon rises. Eleanor checked her weapons with cold precision. They're accelerating their timeline. Something spooked them. Word from Fort Ellis, maybe, Marcus suggested. If they know Hayes has been asking questions, doesn't matter. Eleanor's voice carried absolute certainty. They've played their hand. Now we play ours. She turned to Catherine. Get these documents to Hayes. He'll need them to prove the conspiracy. To Marcus, alert your riders. When the signal comes, hit their communications first. Blackwood's men need to be blind and deaf. And Davis? Maria asked. Leave him to me. Eleanor mounted Midnight, feeling the stallion's eagerness beneath her. The sheriff needs to learn what happens when you betray not just a woman, but an entire community. As her allies melted into the darkness, each to their assigned tasks, Eleanor surveyed the valley below. Blackwood's men continued their preparations, unaware that their carefully laid plans were already unraveling. They expected to face a single adversary, the legendary Phantom Rider making one last desperate stand. Instead, they would face an entire community united against them. Every person Blackwood and Davis had dismissed as unimportant, Chinese workers, Mexican families, women they'd underestimated, all had become part of an invisible army preparing to strike. Eleanor touched Richard's letter, still carried close to her heart. Her husband had understood something Blackwood never would. True strength wasn't in military might or careful plans. It was in the bonds between people, the loyalty earned through years of mutual respect and support. The night wind carried sounds of preparation from the valley. Men checking weapons, horses being readied. Let them prepare. Let them think their superior numbers and military precision guaranteed victory. They were about to learn why the Phantom Rider had chosen this particular valley for her retirement. To Marcus, have your people start moving the hidden horse herds further into the mountains. Not just mine, everyone's best breeding stock. We'll need them to rebuild. Catherine received different instructions. Your father's clinic, it needs to be ready, not just for injuries, but for treating chemical exposure. And Catherine, prepare for the worst. These men won't show mercy. Maria's task was perhaps most crucial. Your people know the old ways, the paths that don't appear on any map. When the shooting starts, you'll need to get the children and elders to safety. Use the routes we discussed. As her allies departed to their tasks, Eleanor made one final preparation. From a hidden cache in the rocks, she retrieved a package, wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside lay her original performing costume, not the theatrical version, but the practical gear she'd used while learning her craft. The leather was still supple, the reinforced seams strong. Special pockets held ammunition in precise arrangements, allowing for rapid reloading even at full gallop. Every piece had been designed not for show, but for survival. Been a long time, Hayes observed, returning from his own reconnaissance. Not as long as they think. Eleanor checked the costume's hidden armor panels, steel plates sewn between layers of leather. Richard insisted I practice in it monthly. Said skills were like gardens, needed regular tending. Your husband was a wise man, wiser than I knew. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. He saw this coming. All those years, he wasn't just helping me maintain skills. He was helping me prepare for war. A flash of light from the valley signaled Blackwood's men beginning their final preparations. Eleanor gave Hayes last-minute instructions. When you see the signal fires on Eagle Ridge, move your deputies into position, not before. We need Davis to think his plan is working until the last possible moment. And Blackwood, Eleanor's smile, was cold as mountain frost. Let him focus on the Phantom Rider. Let him think this is about settling an old score. By the time he realizes what he's really facing, it'll be too late. Because Blackwood had made a fatal error in his calculations. He thought he was facing a legend past her prime, a single rider he could break through superior force. Instead, he was about to confront something far more dangerous, a community united, fighting not just for horses or land, but for their very way of life. And at their center, riding out of history like an avenging spirit, the Phantom Rider was about to give her greatest performance, not for applause or acclaim, but for justice long delayed and debts finally coming due. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of blood and steel as Blackwood's operation began its first major thrust. Through the valley's morning mist, Eleanor watched his forces deploy with military precision, teams of 4 riders spreading out in standard cavalry formation, their movements betraying years of battlefield experience. From her hidden position, in the rocks above Crystal Pass, she noted how they positioned themselves to cover every apparent escape route. Standard military doctrine, perfectly executed, and completely wrong for mountain warfare. The first indication that Blackwood's carefully laid plans were unraveling came from an unexpected quarter. His advance scouts, pushing through the narrow pass below Eleanor's position, suddenly pulled up short. Their horses, well-trained cavalry mounts, refused to advance. Eleanor allowed herself a grim smile. Maria's people had spent the night spreading mountain lion scent along strategic paths. To Blackwood's trained military horses, bred for open plains and cavalry charges, the unfamiliar predator smell triggered instinctive fear responses. "Clever," Hayes whispered from his concealed spot nearby. "They'll have to dismount, lead the horses through, breaks their formation, slows their advance." "More than that," Eleanor replied softly. "Watch their flanks." As if on cue, movement flickered. Through the underbrush on both sides of the pass. Nothing obvious, just enough to make already nervous horses more skittish. Marcus's riders, using skills honed through generations of mountain life, were herding Blackwood's forces exactly where Eleanor wanted them. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. By making certain paths appear dangerous or impassable, they were, channeling Blackwood's men toward what seemed like easier routes. In reality, they were being funneled into natural bottlenecks where smaller forces could effectively engage larger ones. Through her spyglass, Eleanor observed the operations commander, not Blackwood himself, but his lieutenant, the scarred man from the Thompson raid. He was growing visibly frustrated with the delays, pushing his men to maintain formation despite increasingly difficult terrain. "Signal from the South Ridge," Hayes reported, noting a pattern of flashed sunlight. "They've spotted Davis. He's moving with a group of deputies toward your ranch." "Right on schedule," Eleanor nodded. "He'll expect to find Sarah and the others fortifying the main house." Instead, a series of shots rang out from the valley floor, Blackwood's men encountering their first real resistance. But instead of facing armed ranchers in defensive positions, they found themselves trading fire with shadows that melted away into the rocks, only to appear again from unexpected quarters. "Maria's hunters," Eleanor explained. "They're not trying to stop them, just wear them down, make them waste ammunition shooting at ghosts." The lieutenant's voice carried clearly through the morning air, barking orders for his men to maintain discipline. But the precision of their military formations was already deteriorating as they adapted to terrain that refused to accommodate cavalry tactics. "Movement at the mine entrance," Hayes warned. Through their glasses, they watched Blackwood emerge, mounted on a magnificent white stallion. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. He'd chosen a mount deliberately similar to her old performance horse. "Theatrical," she muttered. "He still thinks this is about putting on a show." As if to prove her point, Blackwood's voice boomed across the valley. "I know you're watching, Phantom Rider. Come face me properly, or I will start burning out your allies one by one." Eleanor's response was precisely targeted shots that kicked up dust at his horse's feet, causing the stallion to rear. Blackwood managed to stay mounted, but his dramatic entrance was somewhat spoiled. Still can't handle a spirited horse, Colonel? Eleanor pitched her voice to Carrie. Some things never change. Her words had the intended effect. Blackwood's face contorted with rage as he recognized the same tone she'd used in St. Louis when she'd critiqued his horsemanship before a packed arena. "Find her," he roared at his men. "Burn every inch of cover if you have to." But Eleanor was already moving, using paths too narrow and steep for cavalry mounts. Below, Blackwood's forces began a systematic sweep of the area, exactly as she'd planned. Every minute they spent hunting her was another minute for Maria's people to evacuate the vulnerable, for Marcus's riders to secure the hidden herds. A flash of movement caught her attention. Davis and his deputies approaching her ranch from the south. Through her scope, she watched Sarah emerge from the house, apparently panicked and unprepared. The sheriff's men moved in confidently, expecting an easy capture. Their first indication that something was wrong came when shots rang out from the barn. Not wild firing, but carefully placed rounds that separated the deputies from their horses. In the confusion, Sarah seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving Davis's men shooting at empty buildings. Catherine's signal, Hayes reported, noting a pattern of reflected light from the town. Her father's clinic is ready. And Tommy Hayes reports the army patrol routes are still clear, no reinforcements coming for either side. Eleanor processed this information while maintaining her observation of Blackwood's main force. They'd finally cleared the pass. But the delay had cost them. The sun was higher now, morning mist burning away, leaving them exposed on unfamiliar ground. That's when the second phase of her plan began. Shots rang out from multiple directions, not aimed to kill, but to create confusion. Blackwood's men found themselves under fire from positions that seemed to shift and multiply. Standard military responses, establishing firing lines, seeking cover, only made them more vulnerable to the hit-and-fade tactics of mountain fighters. "They're splitting up," Hayes noted with professional approval. "Trying to cover too. Many approaches at once." "Exactly." Eleanor checked her weapons. "Time for the next act. Get word to Marcus. Start closing the outer ring. Push them toward the canyon." But before Hayes could relay the message, new gunfire erupted from an unexpected quarter. Through her scope, Eleanor saw fresh riders emerging from the tree line, hard-looking men wearing informal versions of cavalry uniforms. Blackwood's reserves, she realized. He held back a whole company, and they're heading straight for the Thompson place, Hayes finished grimly, where families are supposedly taking shelter. Eleanor's mind raced through options. This new force threatened to upset her carefully laid plans. If they reached the Thompson ranch, they'd find it empty and know they'd been deceived about where the valley's residents were hiding. Change of plans, she decided. Signal Maria. Tell her to light the high beacons now. We move everything forward. As Hayes sent the message, Eleanor prepared for her part in the adjusted strategy. Blackwood's arrival had forced her hand, but it also presented an opportunity. His obsession with personal revenge made him predictable. Right on cue, his voice carried across the valley again. "Stop playing games, Phantom Rider. Face me like you did in St. Louis, unless you've lost your nerve along with your youth." Eleanor checked her special ammunition, rounds loaded with precisely measured powder charges for exceptional accuracy. Richard's last gift to her, handcrafted for the weapon she carried. "You're right, Colonel," she called back, her voice seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. "No more games. But we're not in St. Louis anymore. Welcome to my theater." With that, signal fires blazed to life on every surrounding peak. Blackwood's men, already unnerved by the ghost-like resistance they'd encountered, found themselves surrounded by rings of flame that seemed to ignite simultaneously. In the chaos that followed, as military discipline began to crack under the strain of fighting an enemy they couldn't properly engage, Eleanor implemented the next phase of her strategy. But this wasn't just about military tactics or superior position. This was about showing Blackwood, Davis, and every man who'd underestimated her that the Phantom Rider's legend wasn't built on theatrical tricks. It was built on a foundation of absolute skill, precision, and understanding of her environment. The real performance was about to begin. And like all great shows, it would start with an act nobody saw coming. Through the mounting chaos, Eleanor detected a subtle pattern in the enemy's movements. Blackwood's reserves weren't just heading for the Thompson Ranch. They were establishing a secondary perimeter, creating layers of containment. A strategy she recognized from her study of military history. "He's not just trying to trap us," she murmured to Hayes. "He's preparing to funnel refugees into prepared killing zones. Those prisoner wagons we spotted, they're not for taking hostages. They're bait." Hayes caught her meaning. He expects people to surrender when they see a chance for mercy. Exactly. Standard military psychological warfare. Break the enemy's will to fight by offering apparent safe options. Eleanor's voice hardened. But he's forgotten something crucial about mountain people. As if to illustrate her point, new developments unfolded across the battlefield. Blackwood's men, pushing toward what they thought were civilian hiding spots, instead found carefully prepared obstacles. Fallen trees that appeared natural but had been strategically weakened. Paths that seemed solid but concealed treacherous drops. Every step forward cost them time and confidence. "Signal from the North Ridge," Hayes reported. "Marcus's people report Blackwood's supply lines are stretched thin. Their horses are tiring from the altitude and rough terrain." Eleanor nodded, pieces falling into place. "They brought plains-bred cavalry mounts into mountain country. Those horses aren't conditioned for this elevation or these slopes. Within hours, they'll be exhausted." Through her scope, she watched Blackwood's frustration mounting as his carefully planned operation began to unravel. His men were firing at shadows, wasting ammunition on targets that seemed to appear and vanish at will. Military discipline was eroding under the psychological strain of fighting an enemy they couldn't effectively engage. "New movement at the mine?" Hayes warned. "They're bringing out more equipment. Looks like demolition charges." Eleanor studied the activity through her glass. "Not just charges. See those metal drums? Chemical agents, like the ones they used for clearing trenches. In the war, they're preparing to poison water sources, make entire sections of the valley uninhabitable. But why? If they want to control the region, because this isn't about control anymore. Look at Blackwood's face. This is about destruction. If he can't have what he wants, he'll make sure no one else can either." A series of shots rang out from the southern approach, Davis's deputies encountering unexpected resistance. Through her scope, Eleanor watched the sheriff's carefully arranged attack fall apart as his men discovered their retreat routes mysteriously, blocked by fallen rocks and thorny barriers. "Maria's people have been busy," she noted with satisfaction. "Every trail Davis knew about has been subtly altered. His local knowledge has become a liability. He's leading his men into prepared dead ends." But even as their plans progressed, Eleanor detected a new threat developing. Blackwood's lieutenant was adapting to their tactics, reorganizing his men into smaller, more mobile units. They were abandoning cavalry formations in favor of mountain warfare techniques. "They're learning," Hayes observed grimly. "Good." Eleanor checked her specialized ammunition again. "Let them adapt. Every minute they spend changing tactics is another minute for our next phase to develop." As if on cue, new signals flashed from the eastern peaks. Eleanor decoded them quickly, a smile playing at her lips. "Right on schedule. Marcus's riders have reached the high passes. Every escape route Blackwood planned to use for moving stolen horses is now under observation." "But we don't have enough men to block those passes," Hayes protested. "We don't need to block them. We just need to make them unusable." Eleanor pointed to where Maria's grandchildren were already implementing the next stage. Small, controlled avalanches triggered by precisely placed charges, narrowing paths and creating choke points. Through her scope, she watched Blackwood finally realize something was wrong with his carefully laid plans. His forces, instead of surrounding and containing their targets, were themselves being subtly herded into increasingly confined spaces. "Signal from Catherine," Hayes reported. "Dr. Cooper reports movement in town. Davis's remaining deputies are requisitioning wagons, supplies." "Not requisitioning," Eleanor corrected. "Looting. They think the outcome is certain, so they're starting to grab what they can." Classic sign of discipline breaking down. A shot rang out, closer this time, more precisely targeted. Eleanor moved smoothly to new cover as a bullet kicked splinters. From her previous position, through her glass, she spotted the shooter, one of Blackwood's elite marksmen, using a long-range rifle with a brass scope. "He's brought in specialists," she noted with professional interest. "Military snipers, probably from his old command. See how they're establishing overlapping fields of fire?" But even as Blackwood's sharpshooters deployed, Eleanor's countermeasures were already in motion. Maria's people, masters of mountain survival, had spent the night preparing special surprises for any enemy marksman who occupied the obvious sniper positions. The first indication that something was wrong came when one of Blackwood's shooters suddenly abandoned his carefully chosen spot, cursing and swatting at himself. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. The crushed mountain nettles Maria's children had scattered in likely sniper nests were doing their work. "They're not just fighting us," she explained to Hayes. "They're fighting the mountain itself. Every bush, every rock, every shadow has become our ally." As morning stretched toward noon, the true cost of Blackwood's tactical errors became apparent. His men, trained for rapid cavalry actions, were instead engaged in a grueling mountain campaign. Their horses were tiring, their ammunition being depleted by fruitless shooting at phantom targets. But Eleanor knew they couldn't rely on attrition alone. Blackwood still had advantages: superior numbers, military-grade weapons, and the backing of corrupt local law enforcement. More importantly, he had nothing left to lose. Time to implement the next phase, she decided. "Signal Marcus. Tell him to begin Operation Thunderbird." Hayes raised his eyebrows at the code name, but relayed the message. Within minutes, the first effects became visible. Smoke began rising from multiple points around the valley. Not the threatening blazes of signal fires, but smaller, more numerous sources. "Confusion fires," Eleanor explained. "The smoke will play tricks with their depth perception, making it harder to coordinate movements. More importantly, it will force them to bunch up in clear areas." Through her scope, she watched Blackwood's reaction to this new development. The colonel was no fool. He'd recognized the tactic from his own military experience, but knowing you're being manipulated doesn't always help you avoid the trap. "He'll have to make a choice now," Eleanor continued. "Either split his forces, further to maintain control of key positions, or concentrate them and risk losing his carefully established perimeter." "And either choice works in our favor," Hayes realized. "Exactly. If he splits them, we pick them apart. If he concentrates on them—" Eleanor chambered a round in her long-range rifle. "He gives us exactly the target we've been waiting for." Because, while Blackwood had been focused on military strategy and overwhelming force, Eleanor had been implementing a very different kind of plan. One that didn't rely on superior numbers or firepower, but on understanding the fundamental truth of mountain warfare. The land itself was always the most powerful ally, and she was about to show Blackwood exactly why the Phantom Rider had chosen these particular mountains for her retirement. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across the battlefield as Catherine Cooper made her way through hidden mountain paths. Medical bag clenched tightly. She'd just finished treating 3 of Marcus's riders for minor wounds when she discovered something that changed everything. In an abandoned saddlebag near one of Blackwood's fallen scouts, she found documents that revealed a truth more sinister than anyone had suspected. These weren't just military papers or tactical maps. They were geological surveys, mineral reports, and land assessments dating back 5 years. "Eleanor!" she called softly, reaching the hidden command position. "This isn't just about horses or revenge. Look at these." Eleanor studied the papers, her expression hardening. The surveys showed rich silver deposits running through the valley's western ridge, directly under several of the ranches Blackwood and Davis planned to seize. "Silver," she breathed. "That's why they need the land uninhabitable. They're not planning to rebuild the horse trade at all. They're going to turn it into a mining country." Hayes examined the documents with growing concern. These surveys bear Army Engineering Corps stamps, recent ones. Someone high up in the military is backing this operation. More than backing it, Eleanor realized. These mining permits are already approved, just waiting for filing. They've got support all the way up to the territorial governor's office. A flash of movement caught their attention. Luis emerged from the shadows, breathing hard. "Senora, riders approaching from the east. But not Blackwood's men, different uniforms, blue coats, cavalry insignia." "Army patrol?" Hayes wondered. "No." Eleanor's voice was grim. "Regular army wouldn't risk involving themselves in civilian matters. These are mercenaries, dressed to look official. Blackwood's insurance policy." Through her scope, she counted the new arrivals. 20 riders, moving with military precision, but lacking the formal discipline of actual cavalry. Their horses showed signs of hard riding, suggesting they'd pushed through the night to arrive. "There's our answer about the mining operation," Hayes noted. "Those men are carrying blasting equipment. They're not here to fight. They're here to start immediate excavation once the land is cleared." Sarah Williams appeared, carrying fresh intelligence from town. "It gets worse. Found this in Davis's office safe." She handed over a stack of documents. "Property transfers, mining claims, all dated 3 years ago. Right after Richard died," Eleanor finished quietly. "They've been planning this since before they killed my husband. The horse theft operation, Blackwood's revenge, it's all just cover for something bigger." Catherine's medical training caught relevant details in the papers. "These surveyor reports mention underground water sources, aquifer systems. If they start blasting for silver, they'll poison every water source in the valley," Eleanor concluded. "Make ranching impossible. Force everyone to sell." Marcus Chen joined them, adding his own discovery. "My riders found more chemical drums hidden in the old copper mine. Army markings, but expired dates. The kind of weapons they banned after the war." The pieces aligned into a pattern more devastating than their original assumptions. This wasn't just about Blackwood's quest for revenge or Davis's greed. They were facing a coordinated operation backed by powerful interests who saw the valley's inhabitants as obstacles to be removed. "Signal from the North Ridge," Hayes reported. "Army supply wagons approaching. Official markings, but the drivers are Blackwood's men." Eleanor processed this information, adjusting strategies. "They're moving faster than planned. The chemical weapons weren't just for threatening us. They're going to use them to make it look like a natural disaster. Poison the water, blame it on mining runoff from abandoned claims, creating reasonable doubt," Hayes understood. No one would question a few dozen deaths in a remote valley known for unsafe mining practices. Maria appeared, her dark eyes troubled. "There is more, mihija. My grandson overheard Blackwood's men talking. They speak of other valleys, other communities. This is not their first operation." The implications chilled Eleanor's blood. "They've done this before. Buy up failing ranches, drive out residents, discover mineral deposits. How many other communities have they destroyed?" "Found something else," Sarah added. "Telegraph transcripts in Davis's safe. They've already sold the mining rights to Eastern investors. The contracts are signed. All they need now is clear title to the land." Eleanor's mind raced through implications. They weren't just fighting for their homes anymore. They were facing a systematic operation designed to steal not just land, but entire ways of life. That's why they needed me specifically, she realized. The Phantom Rider's reputation, the legendary horsewoman, went into quiet retirement. When I die defending my ranch, it becomes the perfect story to cover their operation. Everyone will focus on Blackwood's revenge, miss the bigger picture. Catherine examined more of the documents. These mining permits have familiar names: senators, railway barons. This goes higher than we thought. Perhaps, Eleanor allowed, but they made a crucial mistake. They thought they could use this valley's isolation against us. Instead, a series of signals flashed from surrounding peaks. Maria's people reporting enemy movements. But these weren't just tactical updates. They were revealing a pattern of corruption and exploitation that stretched far beyond their valley. Look at these dates. Hayes pointed to the mining permits. They match other land grabs across the territory. The Thompson massacre in Wyoming, the burned ranches in Dakota. It's all connected. Eleanor studied the valley through her scope, watching. Blackwood's forces continue their advance. The colonel was still playing his part, focused on personal revenge. But now she understood. He was just another piece in a larger game. They chose this valley carefully, she noted, remote enough to avoid scrutiny, but with enough valuable bloodstock to make the horse theft cover story believable. They probably expected me to die in the first attack, becoming a tragic legend. Instead, you've exposed their whole operation, Catherine finished. Not yet, Eleanor corrected, but we're about to. Marshal, those documents need to reach the territorial capital, not the governor's office. They're compromised. Take them straight to Judge Morrison. He's one of the few who can't be bought. Hayes nodded grimly. What about the army supplies? Once those chemical weapons are deployed, they won't be. Eleanor's voice carried absolute certainty. Because now we know their real plan. We can turn it against them. Maria, signal your people. Tell them to shift focus from the ranch to those supply wagons. Marcus, get word to your riders. We need those chemicals secured before they can be used. Sarah studied the geological maps. The silver deposits. They're real? Real enough to justify everything they've done in their minds. Eleanor checked her weapons with cold precision. But they forgot something important about silver mining. What's that? It requires stability, order. You can't extract ore from land that's too dangerous to work. She allowed herself a grim smile. Time to show them why this valley earned its name. Paradise has teeth. As her allies moved to implement the adjusted strategy, Eleanor reflected on the layers of deception they'd uncovered. Blackwood thought he was pursuing personal revenge. Davis believed he was orchestrating a profitable land grab. Even the Eastern investors probably thought they were simply backing a mining operation. But the truth was darker, more systematic. This was about more than money or revenge. It was about power. The power to reshape entire regions, to decide who could live where and how they could live. Through her scope, she watched Blackwood ordering his men forward, still playing his role in the drama. He didn't realize he was just another expendable piece chosen for his obsession with the Phantom Rider, his willingness to burn everything in pursuit of revenge. Your move, Colonel, she whispered, but the game you think you're playing isn't the one that matters anymore. The afternoon brought fresh complications. Tommy Hayes arrived breathless from town, carrying news that shifted the battlefield yet again. Telegraph operator intercepted a coded message. Army units are being redirected from Fort Ellis. All patrols moving away from this region for the next week. Official orders, Hayes questioned. Signed by General Stanford himself, Tommy confirmed. But here's the strange part. Found this in Davis's files. He produced a letter that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It detailed payments to the general's private bank account, routed through a series of dummy corporations. The corruption goes all the way up the chain of command, Eleanor realized. They're not just buying local officials, they've compromised military leadership. Catherine, who had been studying the geological surveys, noticed something odd. These mineral reports, some of these test results are impossible. The silver content they're claiming, it's too high for this type of rock formation. Marcus examined the papers with a miner's experienced eye. She's right. These surveys are doctored. There's silver here, but not in the concentrations they're claiming. They're swindling their own investors. Which means this isn't just about mining, Eleanor concluded. They're setting up an investment fraud. Buy the land cheap, show false mineral reports, sell shares to Eastern investors. By the time anyone realizes the silver deposits are minimal, they'll have taken the money and moved on, Hayes finished, leaving a destroyed community and worthless claims behind. Sarah appeared with more intelligence from her network in town. Found something in the telegraph office. Correspondence between Davis and mining companies in California. They're not just planning this here. They've got similar operations prepared in 3 other territories. A template, Eleanor understood. Find isolated communities, create pretexts for land seizures, drive out the residents. Then repeat the process elsewhere. Luis materialized from the shadows, adding crucial information. Senora, in the mine office, maps of other valleys, names marked in red, Twin Pines, Sweetwater Basin, Eagle's Rest, all places where ranches. Burned in the past year, the pattern became clear. This wasn't an isolated operation, but part of a systematic campaign to reshape the entire frontier. Communities were being destroyed not just for profit, but to change the very nature of the territories. That's why they need the horse trade destroyed, Eleanor realized. Ranching communities are too independent, too connected to the land. Replace them with mining operations controlled by Eastern money. And you control who can live here, who has power, Hayes nodded. But why target you specifically? The Phantom Rider connection seems almost too perfect. Eleanor smiled grimly. Because they needed a story that would overshadow the truth, a personal vendetta, a legendary showdown. It's the kind of tale that would capture attention, make people miss the bigger picture. Catherine discovered more evidence in Davis's medical records. Look at these death certificates from other valleys, all listed as mining accidents, natural causes. But the patterns, these are chemical weapon signatures. They've been testing their methods, refining their approach. Through her scope, Eleanor watched Blackwood's forces continuing their advance, still following their original plan. The colonel was focused on his revenge, unaware he was just a pawn in a larger scheme. Signal from the East Ridge, Hayes reported. Those mercenaries in army uniforms, they're setting up artillery positions, not for fighting. They're preparing to shell the valley's water sources. Creating natural contamination, Eleanor nodded. Make it look like the land itself is becoming poisoned, force people to leave. No one would question a few dozen deaths in a mining country. Maria appeared with intelligence from her network of observers. The supply wagons carry more than weapons. Found these in a hidden compartment. She produced land deeds, blank except for official seals and signatures. Pre-signed transfers, Hayes examined them. Once the original owners are gone, they can fill in any names they want, create a paper trail that looks legitimate. Eleanor processed this information, seeing how it connected to everything they'd uncovered. This goes beyond Blackwood, beyond Davis, beyond even the corrupt officials. This is about reshaping the entire frontier, community by community. Sarah studied the tactical maps they'd captured. These supply lines, the timing of army patrols, someone's coordinating this from higher up, someone with access to military logistics, government resources. And we've got proof now, Eleanor noted. Documents showing the whole operation. The fraud, the murders, the official corruption. If we can get this evidence to Judge Morrison, we'll need a distraction, Hayes pointed out. Something big enough to cover the messenger's escape with the documents. Eleanor's smile was cold. Oh, they'll have their distraction. Blackwood wants his grand confrontation with the Phantom Rider. Let's give him a show he'll never forget. She turned to her assembled allies, each now understanding their part in a much larger battle. Maria, your people know which water sources are vital. Protect them at all costs. Marcus, get word to your riders. Target those artillery positions before they can deploy. Catherine, make sure your father's ready for chemical exposure cases. And Blackwood, Sarah asked, let him play his part. His obsession with personal revenge makes him predictable. While he's focused on finding me, Eleanor checked her specialized ammunition one final time. We'll be dismantling everything he and his masters have built, because while Blackwood dreamed of defeating the legendary Phantom Rider, Eleanor Lambert was preparing to expose a conspiracy that stretched across territories. The performance he expected would become something very different, a revelation that would shake the frontier to its foundations. The sun began its westward descent, shadows lengthening across the battlefield. In the valley below, Blackwood's forces continued their methodical advance, still following their original plan. They didn't realize that every step forward took them deeper into a trap that had nothing to do with horses or personal vendettas. This wasn't just about defending a ranch anymore. It was about protecting a way of life, exposing corruption that threatened not just their valley, but communities across the frontier. And Eleanor Lambert was about to show them why some legends become more dangerous when they have something bigger than themselves to fight for. Sunset painted Paradise Valley in shades of crimson and gold as the final act of this frontier drama unfolded. The exposed conspiracy had forced Blackwood's hand, pushing him toward increasingly desperate measures. His remaining forces had consolidated around the mine entrance, using the stolen horses as living shields. Eleanor watched through her scope as the colonel paced before his men, the mask of military discipline finally cracking, the evidence of his true role as just another pawn in a larger game had shattered his carefully maintained facade. "You've lost everything, Phantom. Rider!" His voice carried across the valley. "Your allies are scattered, your ranch is burning, and your precious horse will be mine before dawn." But Eleanor knew better. Through carefully hidden trails, Maria's people had already evacuated every valuable animal to secret mountain pastures. The ranch buildings might burn, but they were just structures. The heart of the valley, its people, its horses, its future, remained intact. "He still doesn't understand," Catherine whispered from her position beside Eleanor. "Even now, he thinks this is about him, about your old rivalry." "Let him think that." Eleanor checked her specialized ammunition one final time. "His obsession makes him predictable. More importantly, it keeps him from realizing what's really happening." Through her scope, she observed the rest of the battlefield. Judge Morrison's riders were already in position, hidden in the high passes, having received the evidence of corruption. U.S. Marshals summoned by Hayes's telegraph approached from 3 directions. Most importantly, Marcus's people had secured the chemical weapons and mining explosives, preventing their use against the valley's water sources. "Signal from the South Ridge," Sarah reported. "Davis tried to run. Maria's grandsons intercepted him at Thunder Pass. He's in custody, singing like a canary about the whole operation." Eleanor allowed herself a grim smile. The sheriff's detailed confession would help expose the entire conspiracy, the fraudulent mining claims, the murdered ranchers, the corrupted officials. But first, they had to deal with Blackwood. The colonel had arranged his remaining forces in a defensive circle, clearly expecting a frontal assault. His military mind couldn't conceive of any other approach. That's when Eleanor implemented the final phase of her strategy. "Maria," she called softly, "light the signal fires." Flames sprang up on every surrounding peak, not randomly but in precise patterns. To Blackwood's men, it would appear they were surrounded by superior forces. In reality, The fire served a different purpose. They were drawing attention. "Riders approaching from the east," Hayes reported. "Army patrol, real ones this time." "Word of the conspiracy reached Fort Ellis faster than expected." Eleanor nodded. The general's banking records proved useful. Once his corruption was exposed, the honest officers moved quickly. But she knew Blackwood wouldn't surrender quietly. He had one card left to play, her own reputation. If he could goad her into a public confrontation, create the legendary showdown he'd dreamed of, he might still salvage something from the wreckage of his plans. "Come face me, Phantom Rider," he shouted, desperation edging his voice. "Or are you afraid to meet me on equal terms? Where's that famous courage from the show days?" Eleanor's response was precisely targeted shots that disarmed 3 of his lieutenants without drawing blood. A demonstration of skill that carried its own message. She could have killed them at any time. "Still trying to make this personal, Colonel." Her voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Still can't accept that you were just a tool, a convenient distraction while your master stole land and lives across the frontier." She watched him process her words and saw the moment understanding finally cracked his military bearing. All his careful planning, his decade of obsession, had served someone else's purpose. He'd been selected precisely because of his grudge against her, used to provide cover for a much larger operation. "It's over, Blackwood," she continued. "Davis confessed. The mining fraud is exposed. Your masters in the territorial government are already being arrested. Even your army contacts have abandoned you." As if to emphasize her point, more riders appeared on the horizon, U.S. Marshals approaching openly, their badges catching the last sunlight. Among them rode Judge Morrison himself, carrying the evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy. Blackwood's men began to waver, realizing their position was untenable. One by one they lowered their weapons, but the colonel himself seemed to crack, years of frustrated rage finally breaking through his military discipline. "None of that matters!" he screamed, drawing both pistols. "This was always about you and me, about proving who's better, about—" His words ended in a startled gasp, as Eleanor's shot knocked both guns from his hands with surgical precision. She'd used Richard's special ammunition, rounds designed not to kill, but to disarm, to end conflicts without bloodshed. "That's where you're wrong, Colonel," she replied calmly, emerging from cover. Midnight moved beneath her with fluid grace as she approached the mine entrance. "This was never about us. It was about something much larger. About protecting not just a ranch or a reputation, but a way of life." The remaining fight drained from Blackwood as he saw the forces arrayed against him. U.S. Marshals moved in from 3 directions. Army patrols appeared on the ridgelines. Most tellingly, the very communities he'd dismissed as backward and vulnerable now stood united, armed not just with weapons, but with evidence of his crimes. "Take him," Judge Morrison ordered. As marshals moved to arrest Blackwood and his remaining men, the judge turned to Eleanor. "The evidence your people gathered, it's extraordinary. Land fraud, murder, corruption, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. This will change everything." Eleanor watched as Blackwood was led away, a broken man finally confronting the truth of his own insignificance. But her work wasn't finished. Throughout the valley, communities were already mobilizing to help those whose ranches had burned, sharing resources and support. "The conspirators thought our isolation made us vulnerable," she told Catherine as they rode back toward town. "They never understood that out here, independence and interdependence go hand in hand. We survive because we stand together." In the days that followed, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged. Davis's confession led to arrests throughout the territorial government. The fraudulent mining claims were exposed, protecting other communities from similar schemes. Most importantly, the valley's residents began the process of rebuilding stronger. For having faced this challenge together, Eleanor's reputation changed too. The legend of the Phantom Rider evolved from tales of theatrical skill to something more meaningful. Stories of justice served, of communities defended, of corruption exposed. She had become more than a performer. She was a symbol of frontier, justice, and resilience. 1 month after Blackwood's arrest, Eleanor stood on her porch watching the sun rise over Paradise Valley. The burned buildings were being rebuilt, the scattered herds returning. More importantly, new alliances had been forged in fire between ranchers and miners, settlers and natives, all those who called this rugged land home. Midnight nickered softly from his corral, enjoying the morning air. Eleanor smiled, remembering Richard's words about some talents being meant for more than show. He'd understood something fundamental about both horses and humans, that true strength comes not from dominance, but from partnership, not from standing alone, but from standing together. Marshal Hayes rode up, bringing news from the territorial capital. Judge Morrison's prosecutions are proceeding. The evidence was ironclad: land fraud, murder, corruption. They won't trouble anyone else. And Blackwood broke completely when he realized how he'd been used, confessed everything, trying to prove he wasn't just another pawn. Ironic, his obsession with you helped expose the very conspiracy that used that obsession. Eleanor nodded, watching morning mist rise from the valley floor. The same terrain that had helped them defeat Blackwood's military tactics now promised new beginnings. Already, families were adapting, incorporating lessons learned during the crisis. Maria's people shared their knowledge of mountain survival. Marcus's riders taught others their horse-handling techniques, and Catherine established a network of medical stations throughout the region. You could return to performing, Hayes suggested. Your reputation is bigger than ever. Eleanor shook her head, studying the community gathering below. Ranchers and townspeople working together to rebuild burned structures, sharing resources and skills. This was her true legacy, not the theatrical skills that had made her famous, but the way those skills had helped protect something precious. The Phantom Rider served her purpose, she replied. But out here, we need more than legends. We need people willing to stand together, to fight for what matters. As if to emphasize her point, young Luis rode up, leading a string of horses, some of Midnight's offspring, bred with local stock to create animals suited for mountain life. The boy had grown during the crisis, like so many others who'd discovered their own strength in facing adversity. Besides, Eleanor smiled, watching the valley come alive with morning activity. Some performances don't need an audience. They just need to serve justice. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. In Paradise Valley, a new day was dawning, not just for Eleanor Lambert, but for all those who called this rugged land home. They had faced corruption and greed, military force and criminal cunning, emerging stronger for the challenge. And if new threats arose, they would face them the same way, not as isolated individuals, but as a community bound by something stronger than fear or force. Because some legends don't need theatrical tricks or dramatic showdowns. They just need to remind people that justice, like hope, rides on whenever good people stand together. In the weeks that followed, the full impact of what had transpired in Paradise Valley rippled across the frontier. Additional evidence emerged from Davis's files, exposing similar operations planned for other territories. Judge Morrison's investigation uncovered a network of corruption stretching from California to Dakota Territory. They found more documents, Hayes reported during his daily visit. Investment prospectuses ready to be sent east, promoting mining operations in valleys that hadn't even been seized yet. They were planning to repeat this scheme across the entire frontier. Eleanor nodded, examining the latest intelligence. And each time, they planned to use local conflicts as cover. In Dakota, they were going to exploit tensions between ranchers and farmers, In Oregon, it was logging rights disputes. Always the same pattern, Catherine added, spreading out a map marked with potential targets. Find communities that could be divided, create artificial conflicts, then swoop in during the chaos to seize control of the land. But Paradise Valley had changed that calculus. News of how a remote ranching community had exposed and defeated such a sophisticated operation spread rapidly. Other territories began examining suspicious land deals and mysterious accidents with new scrutiny. 4 more conspirators arrested in Wyoming, Sarah reported, reading from the latest Telegraph. Former military officers, all connected to General Stanford. They were setting up a similar operation using water rights disputes as cover. The territorial capital buzzed with activity as Judge Morrison's prosecution expanded. Each new revelation led to more arrests, more exposed corruption. Senators who had backed the mining schemes suddenly retired. Railway barons who had planned to profit from forced land sales found themselves under investigation. They never expected resistance, Marcus observed, watching his riders train newcomers in mountain survival techniques. They thought isolated communities would be easy targets. Eleanor watched young Luis leading a training session on hidden trails and lookout points. The boy who had once moved like a shadow now taught others his skills, helping create a network of mountain watchers that would make future schemes harder to implement. That was their fundamental mistake, she agreed. They saw our isolation as weakness, never understanding it was actually strength. Out here, we depend on each other because we have to. The changes weren't just political. Throughout the valley, new connections forged in crisis became permanent alliances. Maria's people, once living on the margins, now openly shared their generations of mountain knowledge. Chinese families like the Chens found their expertise in horses and mining actively sought after. Catherine's medical practice expanded, incorporating both traditional Western medicine and healing techniques learned from native practitioners. Her network of clinics, spread throughout the region's remote areas, became gathering points for sharing information and building trust between different communities. Found something interesting in Blackwood's personal effects, Hayes mentioned. One evening, letters from his military days, before the massacre that ended his career. He wasn't always the man we faced. Something broke in him long before he met you. Eleanor considered this as she watched the valley's evening activities. Families working together to rebuild burned structures, sharing meals and stories. Children playing games that mixed cultures and languages. This was what real strength looked like, not domination or revenge, but cooperation and growth. The difference is choice, she said finally. Blackwood chose to let bitterness consume him. We chose something else. The valley itself was changing, adapting while maintaining its essential character. The burned ranches were rebuilt with improvements suggested by various community members. Water sources were protected by both physical defenses and human watchers. Communication networks, formal and informal, spread throughout the region. Received an interesting proposal, Judge Morrison said during one of his visits. Territory wants to establish a special investigative unit focused on land fraud and corruption. They'd like you to advise me. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. They want the Phantom Rider to work with law enforcement? They want Eleanor Lambert, the judge corrected. The woman who saw through the deception, who helped expose corruption that threatened the entire frontier. Your shooting skills were impressive, but your real talent was bringing people together, helping them stand against injustice. The offer was tempting, but Eleanor had other plans. The valley's success had attracted attention from other communities facing similar threats. People came seeking advice on protecting their lands, building alliances, recognizing and resisting corruption. We're establishing a school, she told Hayes one morning. Not just for riding or shooting, but for all the skills we needed during The crisis, strategy, communication, community building. Maria will teach mountain craft. Marcus handles horsework. Catherine adds medical training, teaching others to protect themselves. Hayes nodded in approval. Better than rushing to help after trouble starts. The legacy of Paradise Valley's resistance spread in other ways too. Communities throughout the frontier began establishing their own networks, sharing information about suspicious land deals or unusual accidents. The corruption that had once thrived in shadows found itself exposed to increasingly watchful eyes. 1 year after Blackwood's arrest, Eleanor stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The scars of battle had faded, replaced by signs of growth and adaptation. New buildings incorporated designs from multiple cultures. Fields and pastures showed innovative farming techniques shared between different groups. Midnight's offspring roamed the high pastures, carrying traits from various breeding programs. Like the community itself, they represented the strength that comes from combining different bloodlines, different traditions. "Rider approaching," Luis called from his watchpost. The boy had grown into a young man, now training others in the art of mountain observation. Army escort, carrying official dispatches. The news, when it came, was significant. The territorial governor implicated in the conspiracy had resigned. Reforms were being implemented, aimed at protecting vulnerable communities from land fraud schemes. Paradise Valley's example had sparked a larger movement for frontier justice. But Eleanor's attention was on smaller, more immediate matters. The daily work of maintaining connections, solving disputes, sharing resources. The quiet victories that came not from dramatic showdowns, but from people choosing to stand together. "They'll write stories about this place," Catherine predicted, watching children from different backgrounds playing together near the schoolhouse, about how a legendary rider helped expose corruption and save a community. Eleanor shook her head, smiling. Let them write about what really matters, how a community saved itself by refusing to be divided. That's the story worth telling, because in the end, the true legend of Paradise Valley wasn't about a single rider's skills or courage. It was about people discovering that their greatest strength lay not in standing alone, but in standing together, not in fighting personal battles, but in defending shared values. And if new threats arose, if other forces tried to exploit or divide frontier communities, they would find something waiting for them. Not just physical defenses or watchful eyes, but the most powerful force of all, people who had learned to trust each other, to work together, to fight for something larger than themselves. That was Eleanor Lambert's real legacy, not the theatrical skills that had made her famous, but the lessons she had helped her community learn. That true justice rides not on a single horse, but on the combined strength of people united in purpose and resolve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.